Hi, cousins. Welcome to The Soft Spot, part of Plot Twist Please, the podcast. This is for when you just need a bite-sized nugget. Just something to carry you to the next day. Nothing lengthy, just something short and sweet. So, hopefully that can be this for you. Today, I really wanted to talk about autism and self-awareness. I think a lot of autistic people, including myself, as adults, have learned over time to be extremely self-aware. I don't know about you, but when I was little, I was always told how self-aware I was, how quote-unquote wise I was for my age, or wise beyond my years, etc., etc. And I don't think those people telling me that realized that they were just sensing the tism. It was just the tism all along. It wasn't me being wise. It was me being really observant because of my autism and having to watch what happened in a room before I partook in it, while having to watch the way a conversation flowed before I fell into the rhythm. And even sometimes then I would not fall into the rhythm correctly. I would come in on the wrong beat. I would hold a beat for too long. It was never quite right. But a lot of us are told this, that we are quote unquote wise beyond our years, because that we are extremely self-aware. And I think that is because people attribute self-awareness to wisdom. And I'm going to kind of throw a curveball at you here. It's not always as such. Self-awareness just means you're aware of yourself. It doesn't necessarily mean you're aware of how you fit in the grand scheme of things, or that you're even aware of what's going on in the world, or how other people are feeling, or what they're thinking, or what they think about you. And this was a really hard lesson to learn that I've really had to butt my head a few times in order to learn. And for me, a large part of it was always assuming that because I am experiencing something, that someone else is experiencing that same thing. All right. We talked about main character energy in the last newsletter. You understand. Sometimes it can be really easy to think that the way you see the world is the world. But honey, sweetie, darling, sugar plum, that's just not the way it works. But it makes sense that a lot of autistic people think that's the way it works, because we have used self-awareness to survive. From making sure that we're eating nutritious meals every day, to making sure that we know how much of each meal to eat and when, to making sure we're wearing clothes that don't cause us sensory overload later in the day, to making sure that we're using the proper mannerisms and not being too exaggerating with our facial expressions as to make someone feel uncomfortable, and communicating with our facial expressions just enough so that someone knows that we are intentionally listening to them when they speak. It's just so many things that we are in tune with on a daily basis, or that we have to try to be in tune with in order to make it through a day, in order to not come off as rude. And maybe this is just my Black woman experience of needing to be super overly pleasant in order to not seem like a bully. Maybe that has something to do with it in my case. But I also know a lot of autistic people who have that similar experience of what is called masking, and needing to kind of put on a facade in order to walk through the world and kind of blend in, quote unquote. And that's not a sense of blending in because we don't like ourselves, because we don't genuinely like ourselves, because and even for some people that might evolve into a complex. But for a lot of us, it is just because we know how people are. We know how people who don't necessarily understand us are. And we also understand that most people, when they don't understand something, are afraid of it and act accordingly. And a lot of us would like to think we are above that. But even when I find something like a behavior confusing, I have to stop myself. I have to check myself to not resort to the most negative potential intention for that person and assume the best until I understand more. But everyone that is not everyone's resolution. That is not everyone's social posture. And a lot of autistic people have grown to learn that through trial and error. And when I say trial and error, Emphasis on the error. What I find as someone who is very self-aware and has always been, quote unquote, extremely self-aware, what I find is that I tend to need to have this kind of like second brain of knowing how I feel and knowing how I see the world, and knowing that I will often calculate what I do before I do it. I will often make very educated decisions socially. But everybody is not like that. Not in a conniving way, like not in a manipulative way or anything like that. I when I reach out to someone, it is intentional. When I am kind to people, it's intentional. When I am not giving my energy to someone, it's intentional. And I realize that every single person is not like that, because every single person is not used to having to navigate life that way. And particularly non-autistic people aren't necessarily used to navigating life that way. And that is a really hard truth that I think a lot of autistic people have to come to terms with, because I think a lot of us assume, because of trauma, reasonably so, because of that trauma, that other people do things directly to hurt us or directly to ostracize us. But sometimes people just really are not paying attention to us. Like, they're just not even studying us. Like, they are really on their own journey, on their own path, and whether or not they interact with us, or whether or not they take special care of us, has very little to do with us. And me being self-aware, I think there's a clinical term for this, but me being extremely self-aware, and people like me, autistic people who relate to what I'm talking about, who are extremely self-aware, have a hard time with that second brain, with that, like, putting the other person's brain in our brain and being like, oh, this is why they're making these decisions. And it may seem like what I'm talking about is empathy, but I think what I'm talking about is intellectual empathy. I recently came to understand that intellectual empathy and emotional empathy are not the same. Like, and I consider myself to be highly empathetic. Like, literally, if I watch a movie where somebody gets hurt, I feel that same pain on my body part. Like, it is a physical sensation that I feel, like, within my nerves. If someone gets slapped in the face on screen, my face hurts. That is just the way my body works. And I don't watch a lot of action movies for that reason. And if I do, it is between the screens of my fingers covering my face. But I realize that intellectual empathy is different than that. Intellectual empathy is not necessarily being able to feel what someone else is feeling, but it's being able to understand why someone makes certain decisions. And I've been working really hard to expand my intellectual empathy, because it can be really hard to do that when you are working through your own traumas, or even when your sense of morality is experiencing friction, when someone does something that directly contradicts what someone would do in a world that resembles a world you would like to live in. It can be extremely hard to expand your brain to that degree. But I would encourage you to keep expanding that intellectual empathy, and to acknowledge that just because you are aware of yourself doesn't mean that other people are also aware of you, and doesn't mean that other people know exactly what you're going through and can move in a way that is soft for you, or can move in a way that doesn't trigger you, or in a way that gives you what you need. Sometimes people literally do not know what you need, and you have to communicate it. I know, spooky, ruh-roh raggy, I know. But sometimes you really do have to tell people what you're thinking and feeling and what you need. I'm so sorry. But yeah, self-awareness is sometimes not great for that reason. Besides the fact that it can cause crippling anxiety, like, it's something that I think can trick you into thinking that you know everything going on in someone else's head, just because you know a lot of what's going on in your head. And I'd argue more than the average person does. which can be great, but also can be not great, as I've illustrated here. So, that being said, that's all I have for you today. I hope you have a blessed rest of your day. Stay weird. Take care of yourself. See you next time. Bye-bye.